Today's Brown Bag Lunch. I'm Catherine Whalen, Associate Professor here at the Barnes Graduate Center. I'm so very, very pleased and truly honored to introduce today's speakers, and I'm so glad they could find time in their schedule to be with us. They are not only leaders in the field of oral history, they are shapers of the field, and I hope that'll become evident to you right off the bat from the introduction and then from their talk. First, we will hear from Mary Marshall Clark, here on my left. She is the director of the Columbia Center for Oral History Research, located in the Interdisciplinary Center for Innovative Theory and Empirics at Columbia University. She is also the co-founder and co-director of Columbia's Oral History Master's Program here with Amy.
Who really runs it?
And it was just saying that it was started in 2008, and so they're coming up on their 10th anniversary. It is the only program of its kind in the country. Mary Marshall Clark has been involved in oral history since 1991. Formerly, she was an oral historian and filmmaker at the New York Times. She has also been the co-principal investigator with Peter Bierman of the September 11, 2001 Oral History Project, which really focuses on issues of narrative and memory, and has been since published in a book. After the Fall, New Yorkers Remember September 2001 and the years that followed, from the New Press in 2011. She has conducted and directed many, many projects, which are in the Columbia Archives. Those include the Carnegie Corporation, Atlantic Philanthropies, the Council of Foreign Relations, Japanese internment on the East Coast, the Apollo Theater, and women in the visual arts. She also writes on issues of memory, mass media, trauma, and ethics in oral history. Her current work is looking at the global impact of torture detention policies at Guantanamo Bay. Amy Starecheski is an anthropologist and oral historian and is associate director of the master's program, as I mentioned earlier. She consults and lectures widely on oral history education and methods, and is the co-author of the Columbia Center for Oral History's Telling Lives Oral History Curriculum Guide, which is available online.
It is.
And was a lead interviewer on Columbia's September 11th project. She is also a member of the core working group for Groundswell, Oral History for Social Change, where she facilitates the practitioner support network. She received her PhD in cultural anthropology from CUNY Graduate Center. Her book, Ours to Lose, When Squatters Become Homeowners in New York City, is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. Very soon forthcoming?
Yeah, fall.
Okay, fall 2017, or 16, sorry.
I hope.
Yeah, no, that would be great.
You never know though, it could be 2017.
No, 16. And she'll be drawing on her book project in her presentation today. So Mary Marshall and Amy will discuss oral history as a research method and as a mode of public engagement, as well as a field of inquiry. I want to say that I first met Mary Marshall and Amy at the inaugural meeting of the Northeast Public Humanities Consortium, started at Yale University last year, which brings together graduate students and faculty from programs committed to public humanities work. And oral history is a key component of that. And I think what you'll find is what Mary Marshall and Amy are doing is certainly contributing and leading a long-standing program in documentation and archiving through oral history. But they're also approaching this as a form of creative, empathetic understanding and making knowledge, both historically and thinking about issues of social justice in contemporary life. So please join me in welcoming Amy and Mary Marshall.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's such a pleasure to be here. I have far more interest in getting to know you than I'm allowed in the time frame. I think your program is so interesting, and I hope I can come back someday and just listen to some of you make presentations. Because I think oral history could be relevant to some of your work. I'm just dying to know more about your work, but I'm confined right now to speaking for about 10 or 15 minutes about our work. So I've been writing a grant for the NEH, so you're going to get some of that in what I talk about. So as you know, in 1935, the Federal Writers Project was established, and it employed, well, I don't remember, maybe 3,000, but 10,000 narratives were produced out of that. And they were essentially both interviews, some written, most written up, some recorded, some recorded with former slaves who were in their 90s at the time. And so I trace that as a real origin point of oral history, though for many years Columbia has claimed that we are the origin point of oral history because we were the first university-based oral history archive founded in 1948. If you think about it then, the Federal Writers Project closed in 1940, having produced really incredible life stories of people facing difficulties across the United States, but stretching back to the turn of the previous century. And so these are very rich and wonderful anthologized objects in a way, because anthologies were written from these interviews and the field notes from the interviews. I think something like 24 state guides were produced out of it, and so a lot came from it, and also helped us understand who we were at that time. So just news of the day is we're writing to redo that idea now, with a smaller number of interviews, maybe 3,000, and having to do with some of the challenges and crises of our times. Oral history's moved from an obsessive focus on the past to a more open and interested look at the present and the future. And I'll talk more about that, but why would we do a project like that? And what would we learn? I mean, this is what I'm thinking about now, so I'll put it forth. We would capture the economic and cultural crises we live in now in rural and urban areas. We would capture the burgeoning conversation on race and ethnicity. We would attempt to, widen the narrow lens of oral history at Columbia to include indigenous stories and to really introduce culture in our work. And the answer of who we were and who we are now isn't really answers that question. So that's what I want to do today, is to tell you how it all began and to suggest how we've grown. So this is the Oral History Archives. I want to be clear about where we are. These are in the Columbia Libraries, the archives. And they contain reminiscences that go back to the the memories of the draft riots in New York City, so the 1850s, with Charles Berman Game's reminiscences. He was a lawyer in New York City. So Alan Nevins he was a Pulitzer Prize winning historian who was very concerned that with the invention of the telephone, that people would stop writing letters and keeping diaries and journals, and therefore there would be no great literature for historians to write biographies from and to understand why people did what they did. So Nevins was brilliant. He understood completely that as history was becoming more empiricist in the 1940s and 50s, that the great tradition of biography and autobiography was being eschewed, unlike Europe where it was still flourishing. So he had such an ambitious vision, and Amy and I were just chatting before about now that we have two units, we have the Oral History Archives and the Center for Research has moved outside of the library. From 1948 until 2013, there were only 4 directors of the Oral History Research Office. So that's a long time, and a lot of changes happened within these 4 different directorships. So Nevins began with a view towards understanding political history and how it's made. An example of his ambition is that he and other researchers went to interview Frances Perkins. How many people know who she was? Okay, first head of Department of Secretary of Labor, there's first woman in the U.S. cabinet, and she really was the architect of the New Deal. So 60 hours later, and 5,000 pages worth of transcription, you can see chapter and verse how she ran the meetings, what happened, when FDR came in, when he didn't. So now there are 2 biographies of her. So that was an extreme case, but let's just say that an average interview in those days was 10 hours or so. So 5 sessions of an hour and a half each. And this is what differentiates oral history at Columbia from many other oral history-like projects across the country, including StoryCorps and projects that are focused on 40 minutes or less, where you're looking for good stories, but not at life history. So life history has always been the framework in which we've operated. And discovery, the idea that oral history is not just about capturing what happened, but also understanding what didn't happen, understanding countervailing points of view, understanding ideas and dreams that were left behind, as well as ones that were acted upon. So it's the backstory of history in many ways. And Nevins' ambition to keep it focused biographically means that we have about 1,200 life histories in the collection that are more than 20 or 30 hours long, where you can learn a lot about the history of the Eisenhower administration or the history of the mayoral administrations in New York City, how things worked. In the mid-70s, oral history started taking off as a field internationally. There were international conversations that began to influence the way that oral history in the United States was practiced and thought about. And those were exciting times because oral history in the United States, if you think about it, originated with government funding, if you think of the Federal Raiders Project. And the government funded it again in the 1970s through CETA funding, which also funded arts funding, as you all must know. And so the oral history movement in the United States is really an archival movement, where people thought that oral history was equivalent to creating archives of great depth and great detail, and that's what it was all about. Well, in Europe and in other parts of the world, oral history was seen as a visionary methodology to uncover silences and to understand historical traumas like the Holocaust, like fascism, and what it did to people in everyday life for generations after, and much more culturally influenced and culturally informed. So Luisa Passerini, who's still a faculty member with us, wrote a very important book in 1979 on fascism and what it did to daily life. And people she interviewed misremembered or didn't recall whole decades of their daily life existence. And so she wrote a book following the silences. And out of that came discussions of oral history, not just of history, but of memory and subjectivity. What does subjectivity mean? In Europe, where it was really used, to think about oral history, it was, came out of phenomenology in a lot of ways. So it's not just what your feelings are, your perceptions are, your relationship is with the other person, but what has the zeitgeist in your world done with your mind? I mean, how do you respond to that? How does the individual relate to social forms? How does individual memory relate to collective memory? What happens when memory is distorted? So even today, if you look at the burgeoning global movement of oral history, you'll see that in many places around the world, it's most popular and most strong in countries that have experienced some kind of political turmoil. So back to Columbia. So there were my predecessor, Von Greeley, was a brilliant theorist and wrote some important articles in a book on oral history as different than the simple method of archiving, interviewing people and placing items into an archive. So in a sense, he brought the generosity of thinking of these European scholars back home and added his own thinking to that. And then we began to think about teaching oral history and what it meant to scholarship as a whole, not just to the practice of the archives. So we moved from the archives, fast forward again because I don't want to take too much time, we moved from the archives into another platform in the university INCITE, Interdisciplinary Center for Innovative Theory and Empirics, which is run by Peter Behrman. And Peter Behrman and I worked together to kind of rethink the frame of oral history right after 2001. We had not intended to, we had not even met each other before the events of 2001, September 11th. But Provost put us together because we were interested in mounting an oral history project that studied the present, that looked at what was the mass media doing to perceptions of to people's perceptions of the meaning of the events, to the country's perception of the meaning of the events in Washington and New York. How would it then relate to what happened through the government and through the relationship between the government and the mass media? So I was interested in mass media, having worked in the mass media. Peter was interested by virtue of being a disciple of Paul Lazarsfeld, who first used the term mass media when he came to Europe to flee the Nazis, and developed a whole ideology around what the mass media is. So because we're interested in stories and meaning, it doesn't always square with what comes out of the mass media. So we engendered this project. Amy was one of the lead interviewers on the project, to really go around to all the different communities in New York, differently affected, some in the Bronx, some down near Ground Zero, a term I'm hesitant to use because it was a borrowed term, and to do a life history approach to understanding the event. So this is what's radical and different about Columbia's approach than many other approaches. So we were interested in how the people told the stories of their lives before they narrated the events of 9/11. So we began by asking them to tell us where they were from, our standard methodology. We ended up interviewing about 181 first-generation immigrants, and we interviewed people from at least 10, 15 countries in the Middle East and South Asia. And so we interviewed about 80 Muslims, some equivalent number of Latinos. We interviewed artists, and those ended up, interesting for you, being some of our most fascinating interviews, because we used to call them prophets, because they could see what was going to happen. They could visualize it to the future. And those 30 interviews are just of great value in us understanding what the meaning of world history, or what the meaning of 9/11 was, the meanings in New York, in terms of our vision of the present and the future. Just to wrap that up, so we, I think, did 665 interview sessions, coming into around 800 hours, and 600 of those are open and available to the public. We did 4 different projects, including the Life History Project. And we found some interesting things. One is that oral history can work well with social science, that it was helpful to have a sociologist, Peter Behrman, who was interested in the life narrative as a way of studying meaning in society, that we had value not just to historians and humanities scholars, but also to social science, and that it really is a form of research. So 2 things happened at the project is that we revalued the life history approach as the approach that we value the most. And we revalued Nevins' original idea that oral history is a form of research that can add something new that other forms of research don't always add, that are more disciplinary in focus. So out of that, we began to get more and more interest in our collections and also in our teaching. We've run a summer institute for 25 years after the 9/11 project. It really put us on the radar as oral history doing something for the public good, or that has related to the public good, in a way that none of our prior projects had ever done. And so there was some new excitement from people about wanting to learn how to use it for themselves. And our classes were, overflowing. In our summer institutes, we'd have 80 people apply for 20 spots. And we had a scholarship program, a fellowship program from Rockefeller. And we just, we realized we needed more. And so Peter asked me in 2008, was there anything I wanted him to help me with before he was stepping down from a big institute? I said, yes, I'd like to create a master's program. He said, let's do it. And we did. And Amy is essentially running that program. But let me just say that the vision behind that program is the same vision that moved us closer to the present, which is engaging students who are very deeply engaged from their communities, are interested in projects that have real meaning in the world today. So we are having such an exciting time accepting, accepting like 12 to 15 students a year and working with them. In terms of our current projects, I just wanted to show you can go down, if you all can see, I can't, the digital projects. You can look back at our 9/11 project. You can look back at the project we did between 9/11 and when we moved, which was Guantanamo, Rule of Law, which is about 350 hours of testimony from lawyers, judges, former prisoners, psychologists.
Do you want me to try to show them?
Yeah. And then lastly, because I want Amy to have her time, I wanted to just say that in wrap up, our work, because of the new appreciation of life history and the relationality to current events, and to what people are living through in the world today is more intimate, is more granular, is more relational. And oral history theory has moved from the idea of a definition literally of recording a sound file to a co-created interview in which there's a lot of intersubjectivity at work within the interview, not only in terms of people's relation to the world. So that's very advanced now. And we also have come to have a greater, they've changed all this, so I don't know what this is.
Just kind of scrolling around showing people what's on.
Oh, okay. So I was looking for the rule of law project, but we don't really have time. So the next tab up there is the Rauschenberg project. There's a tab up there somewhere. Great. So if you'll just click on the oral history, I just thought you all might be especially interested in this, that we are now working with the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. We're interested in life history, so we're doing a life history approach of Robert Rauschenberg, who's dead, of course, but we're interviewing other people about his life and his times to try to understand why he became so successful and to understand why he engendered so much excitement among dancers and pop artists of all kinds and really, really wild, wonderful people. So oral history has become more visual, more intimate, more connected with the body, and we've done several other projects. One called Speaking with the Whole Body and Mind, in which we had people who were interviewing, women who were living with disabilities, interviewing other women with disabilities, as kind of a feminist approach to the body, to the project of documenting the body in relation to life. And that was very generative. And it's led us to rethink our relationships to how we think about the body, how we interview the body, about the body. And so I guess I really want to stop now so you have time.
Let's see the keyboard. Sorry, guys. Sorry, that is really small. Is it open? Sorry, say that again?
It's on the desktop, so you
Oh,
can
okay.
out of that.
Sorry. I think I have really good eyes, but this is
really
that's
far
not,
away.
That's not my bar PowerPoint. Everything on there is called bar PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. Is that it? No.
We can move closer to see if you can.
Oh, there we go. That's easier. It's like the thing when probably a lot of you don't even have these memories, but where you're like in your middle school classroom and the teacher suddenly like can't work the VCR in the most basic way once you're up in front of the class. So as you all know, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and so my approach to oral history is a little bit different than the way a historian or a journalist, for example, might use the method. I'm interested in what happened in the past, of course, but I'm always often more interested in why people care about the past, how the past matters in the present, and particularly how people take the whole vast amount of experiences and things and memories that can point us to the past and transform that into something that we can recognize in public as history. And so the case study that I'm going to share with you all today is from a larger research project following a group of squatters in the Lower East Side of New York City who occupied abandoned city-owned buildings in the 1980s and 90s and defended them until eventually in 2002, the city made a very surprising announcement that they were going to transfer the 11 of the 12 remaining squats on the Lower East Side to the occupants for $1 each. They would have to bring them up to code in order to keep them, and so that involved taking out mortgages. And they would then become limited equity low-income co-ops. And so for the last now 8 years or so, I've been following them through that process of going from being squatters to becoming homeowners. And today I'm going to focus in on just a part of that, emphasizing sort of the materiality of history and the political economy of history in this context. So I mean this as an example of how oral history and ethnography can work together, and sort of how oral history can be used in public as well. So, using tools from phone trees, and the picture on the left is the eviction watch list, which is essentially a phone tree, to booby traps and barricades. Squatters defended their occupations very actively. This is a newspaper headline from 1995. This is the last major contested squat eviction in the East Village. And I wanted to play a little bit of audio to start off of squatters from this period, talking about what physical everyday life was like, and how the material context of the buildings shaped their social practices and sort of the opportunities and the challenges that they faced in the world. So the first one is Famous Chrome, that's her on the left. She's talking about the early 1990s at a building on Avenue C, and I'll turn it over to her.
Can you give me a sense of what your first impressions were of Umbrella, what it looked like, smelled like, felt like, sounds like?
It was 1991. Most of that whole neighborhood there were a lot of vacant lots, there were a lot of encampments. In those lots there was infrastructure there as far as like the fire hydrants were running water, there were dig outs for people doing their dishes, for washing. Something I engaged with a lot, all of us did, because none of these buildings had running water, either in or out. We didn't have drains, no electricity, or very limited electricity that was pirated out of manholes or through lampposts, or there was a variety. The buildings, they were fairly newly occupied still, thus needed to appear still abandoned. So from the outside, they very much did look abandoned. They were completely blacked out. You couldn't see any source of light coming from inside. A lot of windows missing, a lot of disrepair, very visible, very true on the inside. Also, a lot of the Umbrella House was a 6-story building, and there were stairs, but a lot of them were temporary, made out of police barricades largely, because there were a lot of police barricades around the Lower East Side at that time. And it was dark, it was cold, it was full of rubble. Some spaces had been cleared out as people were like eking out their living spaces. There were a lot of floor joists in place without floors, so you could go up 3, 4, 5 stories and see the framework for floors and where the next space should be, but you could see all the way down to the first floor. It smelled like piss most of the time because everybody used buckets, and not everybody was super great with their piss buckets. There wasn't a standard protocol, so people made a lot of that up, and some better than others. Very dusty, and also lovely, quiet, because there was no electricity in the building, which has a very different, being inside of structures without electricity feel really different than structures with electricity. A lot of the spaces for windows didn't have windows in them, so it was a lot like being outside. And at that time it was summer, and it was bright. There was vacant lots on both sides of us that were full of rubble. The building on the south side had burned, and there was still all of the burned debris there, and then just open sky, which is not the usual experience that a lot of people have, especially in Manhattan. and the building on the north side had collapsed already, and there was a back building still standing, so most of that lot was open, again, open sky, and all of the windows to the north and the south were open, just broad, open space. We had set up for showering. This was actually a couple of years later, after we had established a garden in the vacant lot on the north side. Had routed one of the gutters off the roof to be an open spout that came out about 10 feet from the edge of the building, and that created this like enormous waterfall when it would rain, and that was our shower. Gorgeous, really special, and also really down and out at the same time.
So I'll play you another clip, an elaboration on the theme of Rubble. This is with someone named Chris Flambeau. And I want you to notice the difference in the interviewing style as well. In the clip that I played, sort of classic oral history style. You hear me, who's sort of an insider-outsider in this world, asking a short question and letting her talk at length. The second clip is from a collaborator of mine, a person named Fly, that I'll talk about a little bit more later in the talk. And she's much more of an insider to this world, so you see the narrative going back and forth between really history telling and shared reminiscence.
What must have happened was that before we got there, everyone had shoveled out the debris of the building out of the windows into the back, and we were now actually removing the rubble and taking it to, out into the street. As you know, back then, there was so much abandonment. The way you get rid of something is
Rubble,
fucking
rubble,
hardcore.
rubble, as Maggie would
fucking
say.
rubble life. You live a rubble existence.
Rubble, rubble, rubble.
Yeah, my rubble existence. That was my life. My rubble existence, our life in the rubble, endless seas of rubble.
I know, it's like just carrying buckets of rubble. It's never
Rubble, pushing
ending.
laundry carts of rubble, shoveling rubble, sleeping in the rubble, eating in the rubble.
So the 10th Street flat fire, do you remember when that happened?
It happened just before I got there, because everyone was like, one way you can help us is the 10th Street fire just happened.
The fire here.
It's not in my clip. Is there a mute? I muted it, but hopefully it will go away when we... Okay, hopefully that gives a sense of what everyday life was like in that place and time. Here's some of the media coverage from the legalization. And so as I followed people through this process of legalization, one thing that I noticed was a quickly and just very noticeably intensified process of the production of history. So one thing is that as Famous described, the buildings, especially in the early days, were occupied in secret. And there's a lot of people that lived in these buildings that never would tell anyone who wasn't, in their immediate family or circle of friends where they lived. Deep culture of secrecy and privacy. I'm not going to say paranoia, because they were being, actively targeted for eviction constantly throughout these years. Once their occupations were on the path to legalization, they were able to speak out about this history, and I think you can tell in the spirit of Fly and Chris Flambeau talking together how much pleasure there is in remembering these hard times, and how proud they are, in a way, to talk about what they've accomplished. And so I'll just give a few examples of that historical production and talk about how oral history fits into it. Here's a former spotter giving an archival slideshow and doing a storytelling performance about their history. This is a picture of Fly cataloging and sorting her archive. She's actually working with Brooklyn to try to sell the archive to a repository, in part as a way to pay her increased living cost as a homeowner. So we see a very direct connection between the production of history and sort of more everyday political economic life. These are just some more images from that process. Fly is also, the reason she has this archive is she's been a very active documenter throughout her life. She's an artist and a musician who has lived in these buildings since the 1990s. She's doing an ongoing project called Unreal Estate that involves audio and video oral histories, and a project that she calls Peeps. So here's an image of her interviewing Stanley Cohen, who was a lawyer that represented the squatters in a few of their important legal cases. And so she videotapes these interviews, keeps them in her archive, and then she does a sort of post-production process, live and in person, after the videotaped interview, where she draws a picture of the person and writes down their words behind it. So she has a large collection of these that have been published in a series of books. And so this is a process that very much centers on the buildings and the physicality of the buildings. So the legalization, as I mentioned, involved bringing the buildings up to code. Buildings that had looked, in this case of Bullet Space, which is an artist collective, very obviously like something special, sometimes started to look more normal. And some buildings that had looked that had been hidden were more visible. In general, though, the trend was to this history becoming less visible to sort of an everyday person walking around the streets in the neighborhood. And so this is looking inside out at Bullet Space. You can see some glass bottle mosaic art by an artist named Rolando Politi, and the ubiquitous police barricades as framing lumber that you find really throughout the building. So this is an example of a building that, this is what it looked like outside back in the day. It doesn't have any of that color anymore, but it still has all of this in the entryway that makes it really stand out. This is a building called Umbrella House that you can see that they have rented their 2 ground floor storefronts out to regular neighborhood businesses, but you can still see some of the mosaic work above the door, the umbrella painting that's been above their door for probably 20 years now, gesturing towards the fact that they're in there. In their interior stairwell, you can see graffiti preserved, and so a lot of this is the process of everyday life becoming artifactual, buildings becoming very self-consciously artifacts of this history that in other ways is becoming less visible in the landscape. This is a building called Serenity, one of the few that had a total gut renovation. And so it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but they have some handmade ironwork on the outside of the building that sets them off from other buildings on their block. But the inside was renovated in just the most bland, low-budget gut renovation that everyone has seen throughout New York City, and entirely lost any sort of hand-built character that it had. And so the buildings really range in how they've physically gone through this process. This is a storefront at C Squad on Avenue C being transformed actually into a museum space, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the talk. And you can see again a preserved graffiti wall. This whole space looked like that. By the end, most of it was drywall and new floors and new windows, with this one area kind of preserved as an artifact. And finally, here's a former squatter taking people on a walking tour of his apartment, which is hand-built in a really different style than the sort of gritty mosaic police barricade style we saw in the other buildings. He decided to go very clean and modern and built this entire space himself from recycled materials. So you can see his kitchen cabinets are from a Pan Am jet. He's really proud of that. Everything in his kitchen can be hidden, and you touch the cabinets and it pops open. It's pretty neat. So clearly, as I hope you're starting to see, this process of turning the past into history takes work. It takes intellectual work, it takes creative work, it takes physical work. And so I want to come back to Fly for a minute and play a clip of her talking about some of the sort of playful, intellectual, and creative work that she's done in creating museum exhibits based on the history of squatting in the neighborhood that are both very sincere and very much wanting to share this important history, and a bit tongue-in-cheek at the same time. And the picture you see here is from an exhibit in a squatter gallery where they have some of their roofing equipment up on the wall as art. Oh, sorry, I had to mute it.
presenting it as kind of an anthropological study. And so I made little tags for all the objects, kind of like describing them in this way that you would describe like ancient artifacts, and these people would, you know, for my crusty shorts, I would like, I had a little card that described how these people would sew their patches on with dental floss, because what happens with the dental floss is that there's wax on it, and when you sew, when you wear the clothes and they're warm because, you know, you've got your body heat, and so it kind of fuses the patches to your fabric in a very crusty way, that, you know, crustaceous way that, you know, makes it more permanent, and you'll be warmer somehow with all that wax. So it's kind of like it was kind of like studying some ancient people. Yeah. Because, you know, a lot of ways that we were living were kind of like ancient. You know, we had wood burning stove, we had like, you know, crazy setups for plumbing and lack thereof plumbing, and, you know, peeing in buckets and having, you know, the squatter sink set up.
So, you know, the explanation that Fly is giving is false, right? She's making fun of anthropologists coming upon an ancient people and trying to invent an explanation for why their material culture is the way it is. People talk to me a lot about the feeling that they were very physically intertwined with the buildings through the labor that they had put into them over time. This is Maggie Wrigley. She says, and sometimes you feel very, you know, your building was fragile and you were fragile. You just kept holding on. I put blood, sweat, and tears into the place. My shoulder and my knees and my lungs are forever in this building. So blood, sweat, and tears is a cliche. Saying that her shoulder, her knees, and her lungs are in the building, that's a visceral feeling. She's actually having a double knee replacement this week because her knees were destroyed by the work that she did in that space. Excuse me. People also talked to me about finding history inside the buildings as they were doing reconstruction. So opening up a wall and finding a political poster from the 1870s or a bobbin from the garment factory that was there. And they talked about hiding their own history back inside the walls as they were creating their own spaces. So one person actually covered over an entire wall of art and mosaic as they were rebuilding their space, imagining that someone else in the future would open that up and find it. Another person buried a sketchbook in the foundation of their building. Another person mosaicked the names of the people who had helped her build her space in the hidden concrete base behind her sink that was required by code. So this is a process of people hiding things with the expectation that over time they'll ripen into history and be able to be rediscovered by people who will come after that. So the temporality of homeownership is really evident here, I think. You know, and if the buildings get lost to foreclosure 5 years from now, and you know, contractor tears open that wall and finds that secret hidden message, then it doesn't become history, right? It's required. The requirement of it becoming history is that it has to be passed down through the chain of people who will be using this low-income home ownership over time. And so you see this sort of deep entanglement of history, bodies, and buildings, and the way that looks and feels really different when ownership comes into play. So I just want to close by talking a little bit about the politics of history in a gentrifying neighborhood like this, and really history is part of a political economic process. So, you know, I think we can all understand that gentrification is a process that both displaces people and disrupts storytelling, you know, in part by destroying the places that serve as mnemonic devices for us to remember our past. And so there's some writing in the historical preservation world about preserving storyscapes. You know, thinking of Ned Kaufman's work. Sarah Schulman wrote a book called Gentrification of the Mind that touches on these same themes from a more personal perspective. So what does it take to preserve a storyscape? What does it take to allow people to continue to remember their past? permanent low-income affordable housing is part of that, and the squatters are able to stay in these buildings, to pass them on to their children, to pass them on to other people that they choose who can benefit from them going into the future. I also want to mention the idea of legalization in this case as a process of partial commodification. So these buildings were unusually in New York, impossible to exchange as commodities during the period that they were illegally squatted. They couldn't be bought, they couldn't be sold, or if they were, those legal rights didn't come with any of the use rights we would normally think of them being attached to. And we all know that one quality of a commodity is that it obscures the labor that went into its production, right? Sorry, I hope I'm not getting too Marxist on you all. And so squatters didn't want that to happen, right? They had built these buildings, rebuilt them by hand in many cases, and part of their hope and expectation in doing this historical work is that they can balance that process of commodification. So I'll skip this one just to get to the end and play you one more clip from Fly talking about who she sees her work being for. Oh, sorry.
I think it's going to be a lot of younger people. I think it's going to be a lot of like students of sociology and urban planning, and I think the punk kids are going to like it, anyone who's any kind of housing activist, I think, and anyone who's interested in New York history also. Maybe one day it'll be a textbook.
It is kind of funny to imagine. And so we see, again, an initiative to pass this history down on to people who will be interested in it, who will care about it, who will do something with it. And the last case I want to mention is the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Space, which is the museum in the storefront of C-Squat. And this is a museum that was founded on the idea that common sense public memory was erasing the legacy of direct action and shaping the landscape of New York City. So it was founded by people, for example, who are very active in direct action campaigns for bicycle lanes in New York City. And when we got bicycle lanes, the narrative that you read was that there was this really enlightened, benevolent city planner who decided that we should have bike lanes, and they gave them to us, and wasn't that nice? While these people had been fighting really hard for a really long time to try to get that. And so they realized that if they wanted to recruit new activists to direct action movements, that people had to be able to see that it works, and that they had won these victories. So they created this museum that focuses on the history of bicycle activism and community gardens and squats on the Lower East Side. Very much with the idea of using history directly as an inspiration to act, using it as a recruitment tool for new generations of activists. Of course, all this is very fraught. We know as well that that history can easily become local color in a neighborhood that's being sold and marketed by real estate developers as a place that's unique and has this unique culture, and that's why it's worth investing to pay the rents that people pay there. And so it's not an easy process. It's not a process that I think automatically leads to good outcomes, but it's something that we can see through this combined approach of oral history and ethnography, the active struggle that goes into turning the past into history.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. So, questions?
Yeah, so I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah, lots of time for questions. This is great.
This is fascinating. Thanks so much. I have a couple of interlinked questions, which is, what, in your opinions, what's the difference between, or among, history, memory, myth-making? It's the first. And related to this, do you have any of the buildings that you were describing changed hands since they were passed, as it were, legalized, in inverted commas? And do you have access to the occupants' bank account information, their mortgage information, things that they're not necessarily putting on view?
I'll start with the last because it's a little simpler than history, memory, and myth-making. So I don't have access to their bank accounts. I do have access to their mortgage records because they're all public.
Yep.
Not like easily public, but public. Some of the apartments have changed hands, individual apartments in the co-ops. None of the entire buildings have changed hands. And that would be in the case of a foreclosure, basically. The collectives can't sell the entire building. And so there's definitely a real fear that, as squatters, they had a clear moral, they felt they had a clear moral right to resist eviction. As people who signed a contract and agreed to pay a mortgage, if they then don't pay that mortgage, it's harder, I think, for them to make a moral claim that they can resist. So many people do feel like they're more vulnerable to eviction as homeowners than they were as squatters. And certainly individual people have been evicted through the legalization process, but not entire collectives of people. I don't know if you want to do memory, myth, and history first, or...
I'll take a stab at it just quickly, that these are the preoccupations of our field. And Ron Greeley, whom I mentioned before, wrote an important book called Envelopes of Sound, which is still relevant in a way, although he's written a couple of essays since. But one is called Movement Without Aim, one of the chapters, and where he sketches out the relationship between memory, memory, myth-making, history, and ideology, and suggests that there's always a tension between all four. And he would always land on the history side. He was trained as a historian to be interested in what happened, but what he's interested in with myth-making and memory is how, what Amy was also suggesting, how people make sense of the past, or how people magnify or distort certain aspects of the past to explain events that either happened between the past and the present, or to explain themselves in the present. So that myth-making is a natural thing that we do. In the European context, in other continental contexts, memory, the study of memory has taken on very different kinds of interest, meaning that we're interested through the work of Alessandro Portelli, who's a professor of American literature at the University of Rome, in how people misremember and what that tells us about the meaning they made, and the meaning at that time, and then the meaning later, and the meaning over time. So he's actually more, as Louisa is, Passerini, more interested in memory's problems as a way of explaining ideology that otherwise the impact of an ideology, say fascism, in which a worker is the prototype, is presented as the prototype for the new society, and convinced that he or she will be part of the new society to the point that they lose their own individual identity and therefore lose their own individual memory. And of course that was a distortion, an ideological distortion that then has a resonance across generations. And also studies of the Holocaust and studies of other genocides. Memory making is very relevant to what we think about moral history, but I'm sure there's some cases that you've uncovered where you see also that tension.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's clearly very present, I think, in this work. I really think of history as a particular form of public discourse about the past that has certain forms of authorization and authority tied to it, and as in any society, rules about what counts as true and how do you figure out what's true, often based on the power of what's in an archive or what's vetted by a professional historian. So, I'm really interested in oral history as a way of mediating between other forms of memory and storytelling and that thing that's history, right? That gets to be history. And I see oral history as a tool that can allow people in a situation like this, for example, to translate their experiences, their memories into history in a way that can have authority. I think I'm also really interested in the sort of political potential of nostalgia and maybe myth making alongside that. We often think of nostalgia as apolitical, and I really see nostalgia in this case having a real potential to point towards what people feel was desirable about the past, and it sort of has in it an implicit critique of the present and the way that specifically the way that the city has changed over
but
the time that
it
this
also
has been
has in
happening.
it something that's beautifully said, something about the future.
Mhm.
And so we're not only interested in the past, but the visions of the future that come out of the past. And this utopian community, who are also real-time workers, represent a kind of vision of the future that they help create.
Right. Thanks so much for the great talk. I have a question about kind of the visual aspects of oral histories, and especially to you, Mary, since you're from a film background. I'm wondering, what are the visual aspects? Is there photography? Is there filming as well as audio? And then also kind of thinking of like psychosomatic medicine, sort of, or psychosomatic psychology, where the kind of the bodily processes also are kind of conveyed in a dialogue. So, when you're speaking to somebody, their movements or that kind of convey parts of the message or part of what they're trying to say. And how do you make that visible? Is that something that's like
So,
discussed in the field?
Thanks for that question. I was able to play around with, we had more money at the New York Times when we were doing oral history there. So we actually worked in film, real film. Those were the old days. But it was so clear to me that this is something that needed to happen at Columbia. So when I came, I started vying for it. And within about 10 years, we were able to bring in video as a part of our work and not a full-time part of our work. We kind of created a methodology in which we interviewed people on audio extensively and then went back to them and with our team talked to them about what we saw that came out of that, invited them to then participate in a short video session. This was Carnegie too. And to our shock and amazement, people who had been reluctant to go on video, when they got in front of the camera with people that they'd had lunch with and we discussed their life history and we all kind of convened or in the breakfast to say, what is it we want to do today as a team? So not the normal filmmaking thing where there's one director, but coming out of the life story. We would sit and the person would want to go on for 4 hours. So our budget was totally blown, not 45 minutes, but 3 to 4 hours, with several of the participants and 2 hours with everybody else. They relished the process of integrating their life history and story in a visible way and that they knew would be shared with a broader community. It was a really dynamic and beautiful change. And so I would prefer to work visually all the time. It's just expensive. Now we don't have equipment for our students. We're having to raise funds actually to produce that. But I think the relationality between the audio of the voice, the orality of the voice, the sensuality of the voice, we're beginning to think about narrative analysis where we would compare a transcript with what's in the voice to see if the transcript would even make any sense. And we're having our students now do more work in visuality and memory about gesture, which is highly important. I've been actually studying a little dance theory to understand gesture better. And it's amazing how dancers and choreographers and oral historians work in similar ways in the field encounter, where we actually, follow people. That's a phrase in dance. That we shadow someone. There are all these relational things that ends up with being about gesture and how important gesture is in understanding the story. And if you watch any of our oral historians operate, I think we actually need rolling chairs because we will, I'll be interviewing Amy and I'll feel like she needs a little distance and I'm like that, and then suddenly I'm doing this. And we're now beginning, instead of poking fun at that, beginning to acknowledge that our movement, our presence, and the way in which we tilt our head makes a tremendous difference to what gets said and how it's said. So I feel like we're trying to recapture what was lost in the institutionalization of oral history as a method to decipher political history or something like that, and trying to draw that more towards oral sources. And this is something Luisa Passerini passionately always talked about, was the orality of oral sources, or what's unique about it. And so she's now doing work on the bodies. It's called Bodies Across Borders, and she's coming to be with us in March and April to talk about that European Union-funded project in which she is working with migrants and refugees in innovative ways, where they're not beginning with a life story or recording, but they're beginning by having people bring objects into the room that they brought with them, or drawing pictures of their passage, or doing something creative with their own hands, so to speak, before they're put in the dialogical space. So she may be giving a public short course, actually, we should tell them about this, that you could come to in April. I forget the date, but we'll send you the date. She's really an amazing intellectual in the field.
So can you repeat her name?
Luisa Passerini, Passerini, Luisa, spelled in Italian with O-U-I, and in English with Luisa L-U-I. So I think I was at a conference in Siena in 1987 in which she stood in front of a giant group of people at the international conference and raised her hand, tiny person, and called for, with a gesture, "We have forgotten the visual, we've forgotten the body," and now we're finally sort of getting back to where she is. So I think it makes a tremendous difference. I think people forget the camera as soon as there's a relationship going on. I'm also very interested in still photography, and we haven't really exploited that yet, but the relation of the photograph to the word is something we're going to need to explore as we do our larger projects.
Kind of question that, it's not a question that's going to have a kind of obvious answer, but I'd be interested to hear you reflect on situating the sort of methods of oral history interviews vis-a-vis kind of adjacent fields, which I don't want to reify the kind of distinctions between fields, but I mean, I'm obviously thinking about anthropology, I was thinking a lot about folklore, from everything from the kind of methods of recording, but also the editing, the approach to editing, shaping the interview, whether it's a transcript. I was thinking about this in terms of Maggie Wrigley's Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which was sort of written out like a poem that involved orthographic intervention and what was, or, like those kinds of decisions about presentation, about selective quotation versus long form quotation. And I guess all of this about how recordings are made available, and all of this speaks in a way, going back to something you said earlier on, about moving toward a kind of dialogic approach to interviewing, sort of seeing the interviewer as complicit in a storytelling episode. And how does that change the status of the interview, say, as data for a later content analysis? And what you were saying there about how we mine these recordings for all sorts of kinds of insight, versus seeing the recording as an end in itself, that the recording, is the recording the history or the tools of the history? Is it the stuff from which history is made? This kind of, what's the status of the recording methodologically?
There's never a complete oral history. It's very hard for people who are perfectionists to be in the field. There's never a perfect one. There's never a complete one. Your story belongs to you as long as you live, and sometimes after. So I may have interviewed somebody for 20 hours, and I know it's time to end, A, because of budget, and B, because that person is not going to tell me any other stories about their lives. However, they continue to live and could tell others different stories about their lives. So we always have to be aware of the limitations of what we're doing. And in our classes, I think maybe it's a good time to talk about what we do there. We see our students and we support our students in create very innovative things with the interviews they produce. So I'll just share one example, and then Amy can maybe share a couple of examples. We have a student who is from Trinidad, and she's a consummate filmmaker. She graduated with an MFA from the School of the Arts a couple of years ago, won a lot of national awards, now involved in oral history because she wants to become a writer. So we have a course in our program called Transforming Oral History into Literary Narrative. And she's writing with photographs, Jamaica Kincaid-like accounts of the 6-hour interview she's done with 3 generations of women in Trinidad, to understand the matrilineal culture there and to understand her relationship, her own intersubjective relationship. So she could write a memoir, and that would be fine with us, but she's more concerned with presenting these women in another context so that we know who they are. So her writing is almost like poetry. I did, by the way, have a student once in my method and theory class who, instead of the final paper, wrote me at 2 a.m. in the morning to say, can I submit a poem? And she handed in an 80-page poem of the rendition of the transcript, which was much more readable and sympathetic to the woman. If she was transcribed flatly, if you heard her voice, you could get excited, but the flat transcript was boring. So she created a poem, which was actually contained the meaning behind what she was saying. So now that we're out of the archive and we're not bound by those restrictions anymore, I think we want to see these kind of creative forms. So what would you talk about, Denise?
I mean, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, so I have probably more to say than I have time for, but I mean, I think that there are clear affinities between oral history and anthropology in terms of field methods. You know, at the point that both fields are at, we both really see the researcher as the instrument of the researcher themselves as a subjective person, and the way that we then deal with that is a little bit different. And so I do think the fact that in oral history we tend to treat the interview as the full interview as a thing is really different from anthropology or even other forms of qualitative interview-based research, that we expect to archive the whole interviews. We expect them to be intelligible to an outsider and usable by an outsider, not the original researcher. And so there's always this imaginary public audience for that private interview. That's really different than I think how it feels if you're doing an anthropological life history interview that you might edit, you might use as a source document, you might analyze, but the whole interview itself is never going to go anywhere. Similarly for long-form narrative journalism. And so I think that's an important distinction. The other distinction I would point to is the way that we think about consent and actually the interview as property. So oral history interviews are considered to be a form of intellectual property and are automatically copyrighted when they're produced, and that copyright is jointly held by the interviewer and the interviewee. And our ethical practice is to always sign a legal release with the narrator saying, like, we'll continue to share this copyright, or you'll give it to me, or we'll put it in the Creative Commons. But just using a consent form is not enough for us because there's that property right that needs to be dealt with in some way. Oftentimes, there's a connection between shared copyright and shared authority that goes beyond the moment of the interview. Oral historians have been doing collaborative work with their narrators to interpret interviews, and we really see the interview as part of that interpretive process. I think that also kind of shapes how we think of it as evidence. That we're not collecting stories that we analyze, we're engaging collaboratively in a process of analysis in the interview and then beyond with the people that we speak with.
We should just say for clarification that the Columbia Archives are open to the public. You're not private.
Can I Deborah has questions, maybe you want to go
Well,
first.
I mean, I was really struck by the notion of where is the history, and thinking of archiving a squat in comparison with the tenement museum, which is the same part of town, and what they're trying to do there is, I mean, I think it's very unclear for them where the history is. Is it in the physical space? Is it in the stories that they're trying to dig up? Is it in the archives? And I think it'd be interesting to collaborate in a sense with your project and what they're doing, and for them to become more aware of it, because this is kind of like mind-blowing in a way if you think about the history of the idea of a museum that represents, that these squats are changing and that there's the nostalgia quality. And I mean, this isn't really a question. I'm just sort of thinking about it.
Right, no, like a museum that people are still living in and changing and building and rebuilding
but that they realize that somehow there's a value to this space only in retrospect that's museumable in some way, and that's because of the participation of you as the the interviewer, the archivist, the filmmaker, the photographer, whatever your perspective on it creates something for them that probably wasn't there to begin with.
I think that's not quite accurate.
Okay.
This is a group of people that very much don't need me to come in and like reveal to them that their lives are history worthy. They're people that have been archiving and documenting and sketching and drawing and collecting and filmmaking and producing graphic novels and doing this work all along, which has been a real boon for me because I can be a collaborator and not, it's not my idea to create an oral history archive to document this history, but I did have a skill set and some resources that could sort of take that to the next level. But yeah, I think it would be a really interesting collaboration with the Tenement Museum. And they're kind of moving, they're doing a Puerto Rican New York exhibit now and are kind of moving into, out of that original building, as you might know, and into the 70s and 80s. So this is very much not a time capsule in the same way that the original Tenement Museum building was.
We have a fellow here, conservation fellow, who was a folklorist that actually is working at the Tenement Museum, and it's been really interesting thinking about what you're saying, Deborah, in relationship to her work.
She could have come to 15. She's coming here.
Oh, great.
Come to that.
Yeah.
Conversation.
And I think she was really interesting for us to have as a colleague and as a teacher. And I know some of the students here took classes with her. I have a couple underrated questions, and then we do really need to have a question from a student. But yeah, and I know Bethany does. I think what you were touching on before in Aaron's question is this discussion around oral history about humanities methodology versus science methodology and the kind of institutional reviews that are happening. And there's been really interesting discussion about that, and he and I have discussed that, and our students have discussed that. But I also wanted to ask, thinking about our students who are doing ethnography and interviews, how do you work with that point where your lived experience intersects with your narrators? And I think there's this sense that you're both, I lived through this too, therefore I'm an expert. I understand how my own subjectivity is so specific and limited, right? So that moment's kind of when history and lived experience intersect in the context of an interview. That's something we can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of this project, I was, knew a lot of these people through activist networks and had lived in a squat but not in this neighborhood. And so it was nice because I had some of that shared lived experience, but wasn't, like allied and situated in a way that would make it harder for me to talk to some people than others. I think we kind of encourage our students to think of the insider-outsider line as always dynamic, that there's always going to be ways that you're an insider with someone and always ways that you're an outsider, and just to be aware of what those are and how they might be shaping the conversation. And I found in this work in particular that people often seem to feel that they were only able to talk to me about this because I had that, especially that shared physical experience. Like I know, when they talk about being cold, I'm like, oh yeah, I know about the kind of cold that you're talking about. Like I know about chopping wood. Like I know about the smells. It's like that makes it a little bit easier, I think, to convey some of these really physical sensations.
Did it make it harder in some ways?
Well, we had the same experience in our 9/11 project.
Yeah.
And what we found there, I think, is that as long as we were very quiet as interviewers, it became very useful for people to imagine either that we had a similar experience or that we hadn't. And you could see that changing throughout. And those interviews, we maybe asked 4 questions in 2 hours, or 3 questions or something. It was a different kind of a project. And you could just see them believe me, oh, you were there at Chambers Street too. And then they would say, but you weren't there, were you? Because it was the first time for many of them that they had actually told the whole story to one person, because they didn't want to tell their partners or family or children or even want to revisit it alone. And so it became a case where psychologists would be fascinated to see what were they projecting about us, and we're never neutral, but our quietness, I think, our receptivity to their experience, but with the context of a shareable encounter. And we found that also in the Women with Disabilities project, where I did a couple of interviews with one of the leaders of the project because she was insecure about oral history, and the interview went nowhere until the recorder was turned off. And then the person said to Nesta, oh, what did you have as a child? Why are you in a wheelchair? And then it started again, and then there was a holistic conversation where it just blossomed. And so we've worried a lot about the insider problem, which maybe you're worried about too, for decades in oral history. And I'm beginning to think it's less of a problem, and it's more of an opportunity, as long as if you give most of the space to the other person, and then be totally honest when they ask you a question about your own involvement.
And I think invoking that imaginary other audience is really helpful. Like that, you can't just say to the interviewer, well, because they don't know. And so saying, well, they don't know, can you explain it as if I didn't know? Can be really, that can kind of open that up a little bit if it gets too close.
You had a question? You've had your hand up for a long time.
Well, thank you. These are really fascinating projects to hear about. And I was really interested in your work with the Lower East Side squats. And it's sort of an international story. And I was wondering, do you see scholarship being attracted to these more DIY activist stories? And are you trying to link up with scholars elsewhere? Or right now, is it very localized?
No, I definitely, the field work that I did was mostly localized, but I definitely see it as an international story. So I'm part of a network of researchers that study squatting in Europe, for example. And this is kind of like the satellite story to that in a lot of ways. So those conversations have been really helpful. And I did a smaller companion project in Christiania, which is a squatted neighborhood in Copenhagen, of close to 1,000 people that they've occupied for 40 years. And so I interviewed them about their process of deciding, of trying to come to consensus about whether or not to legalize, and have been from afar then following through the consequences of that decision. And so, yeah, I do think that it's definitely an international story that's hard with this kind of intensive fieldwork to do yourself, really deep comparative international work. So I'm really grateful for that broader network of people who I can then be in conversation with to try to make those comparative arguments.
Yeah, I'm wondering how you feel about, about photo elicitation as a method, and if you ever feel kind of held back by the risks involved in perhaps distorting memory by presenting visual content.
I mean, we don't think of memory as like a thing that you can distort. I think we think of it as a dynamic process, always as a starting point. So, we could kind of recognize, and you might have something different to say about this, that, in every interview, the life story is sort of called up anew in that context, and there's no like authentic life story out there that we are getting or not getting, just what you were saying. So, the trick with us is often working in audio and just finding a way to link the photo with the sound in a way that makes sense to someone else who's using it. That gets to be complicated, but we're really excited about using photographs as a prompt to memory. And I don't think we see it as problematic in that way.
No, because memory is, if we know so well, there's a part of the brain that organizes memory visually. And so we actually want to elicit those memories. And sometimes we do that by asking for visual stories. We ask a lot about, what was the room like? Where did you live? Give me a picture of that. So we deliberately try to draw people into physical bodily memory through our questions.
I know there's a couple over there. I can see that way, I can't see this way.
I'm wondering, this is kind of relevant to two questions back, more about the role of the interviewer. I'm thinking the public library has a big oral history project that's pretty much run by having many people interview each other who live in the same neighborhoods. And I was wondering if you could draw out, not necessarily the pros and cons, but the differences between those two kind of different oral history situations.
I'm sorry, did you hear the last question?
I was just wondering if you could talk a little about not necessarily the pros and cons, but the different situations that would call for the different kinds of oral history projects done by maybe one oral historian versus a community interviewing each other.
Yeah, so the oral history is a big tent, and it's not our job at Columbia to say what it isn't. That's very important. We have a lot of ideas about what it is, and I'm grateful for that project. I've watched a lot of the interviews on that library website or whatever website they have. I think they're wonderful. I encouraged the public library to do this a long time ago because it's a way of coming through the city history and suggesting stories that can lead to greater in-depth stories that other people might do. So I have no argument against it. We tend to do research-based interviewing at Columbia where we actually get our students to produce intellectual blueprints or designs, which is what we do when we take on a big project. We kind of research it to death and then say, what have we learned, if anything, and what can we find out through the oral histories that we don't know from written literature. And so we're always looking to get something new that way. But we totally understand that most people don't have the luxury of time and that kind of research, and that many of the people we interview don't have documents that we can research. And so I think it's fantastic that an institution as valuable and viable as New York Public Library would take this on. So, I mean, every narrative is a narrative. I have more problems with StoryCorps as a model for oral history because the interviewees are asked to sign away all their rights. They're not really given permission to look at the material, use it for themselves. And they're chopped up. They're 45 minutes in which maybe they use 5 or 6 minutes and they rearrange stories. To me, it's great long-form radio. But oral history, I'm not so sure. But I think the library has just tremendous presence throughout the city and the communities where people take their children to read. And I mean, there's so much positive feeling for the libraries. They're doing it for all the right reasons. And I learn a lot by watching those videos.
So maybe we could have one last question formally from Sheila, because I know, Amy, you were on a tight timetable.
I'll just ask, we'll ask a quick question about, and it's a little bit about what you have been talking about, but in terms of, do you feel like you, in some instances, need to have like a fact-checking or a verification process? And how do you go about doing that?
Well, we'll take our Guantanamo project for that. Rule of law. It'd actually be great if we could find it. Just Google rule of law, I think. So that was a situation in which we were interviewing lawyers about the death penalty, and some of the lawyers we're interviewing were also working on Guantanamo. So we thought we would expand our project on the death penalty to Guantanamo. And it's an interesting case because a lot of the sources, we didn't have access to a lot of information about what was happening in Guantanamo because the public didn't have access and the government was preventing access to this information. So we were actually in a position there where we were creating new sources. And so verifiability became very important. And part of how we dealt with that is I chose people, I like to think of it as a control kaleidoscope of different professions that you can go through to understand. We picked people who were very already recognized as public spokespeople who could be trusted. So we started with the Center for Constitutional Rights, then moved some to the ACLU, but in other words, there were tremendous amounts of documentation that we could access about what they were doing, even though there were secrets they couldn't tell. So we had a way to research that, and we picked what I would call reliable narrators. people whom we could trust, because we put this project up immediately, unlike the 9/11 project, which took years to process, because we wanted to make a difference with this project. And one difference it's made is the Columbia Law School and several other law schools around the country use this as their site to teach about American torture in this period of time. And so that became very important. And when we sent people back their transcripts, we encouraged them to be really careful and thoughtful about looking up items. And we've always done this, but I mean, it was a little bit more serious, that we asked people to review everything. A few times we spent more time on what we call audit editing, which is listening and reviewing the transcript and looking up things. We had tremendous amount of research files, including a timeline on Guantanamo, and it was like 25 pages long, and we ordered about 50 books so that we could look things up in books. So I'd say that we wanted this to be well used and respected, and we've always had that kind of due diligence, but in this case, a little bit more. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Mary Marshall and Amy. Lots of us want to think and talk about this more, but I appreciate you sharing your time.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.